The United States Navy entered the Pacific War with one primary anti-ship weapon, a torpedo that had been in development since 1931, tested, certified, and issued to every submarine in the fleet. It didn't work. Not occasionally, not in edge cases, systematically, repeatedly, and at a rate that the Bureau of Ordnance tracked internally and declined to act on for nearly 2 years after Pearl Harbor. Submarine commanders filed reports. They described torpedoes that ran too deep, passing cleanly beneath their targets, torpedoes that detonated prematurely before reaching the ship, and worst of all, torpedoes that struck the hull dead on, at the precise angle the weapon was designed for, and simply failed to explode. The Bureau's official response, in summary, crew error. The men who fired the weapons were submerged inside steel cylinders, hundreds of feet below the surface, under depth charge attack, being told the problem was them. To understand how a Navy goes to war with a broken weapon, you have to understand the economics of the 1930s. The Mark 14 torpedo was not cheap. In 1941, each unit cost approximately $10,000, roughly $210,000 in today's money. The Bureau of Ordnance had a live-fire testing budget that reflected those costs. Full-scale tests against real targets were conducted sparingly. The detonator mechanism, a device called the Mark 6 exploder, was tested in conditions designed to produce favorable results. There were exactly 2 recorded full-scale tests of the Mark 6 exploder against an actual steel hull before the weapon was declared combat-ready. 2 tests for a weapon that would be carried into combat by every fleet submarine in the United States Navy. Both tests passed. Neither test was conducted at the impact angles most commonly encountered in actual combat. The men who designed the Mark 6 believed, on paper, that a direct hit at 90 degrees, a perfect perpendicular strike, would generate the maximum impact force, driving the exploder's firing pin cleanly into the primer. The logic was sound. The physics were correct. What the designers did not test adequately was what happened when the pin, moving at high speed, hit the primer before the detonator housing had fully compressed. The pin bent. Under direct impact, at the precise angle considered optimal, the firing pin bent and failed to detonate the warhead. This was not discovered in a laboratory in 1942. It was discovered by submarine crews in the Pacific by firing torpedoes at Japanese ships and watching them bounce off the hull and sink. The Bureau of Ordnance was informed. Testing was requested. The Bureau declined. The Mark 14 had 3 separate problems. They compounded each other. Understanding how requires understanding what the weapon was supposed to do. A torpedo is not a simple projectile. It is an autonomous underwater vehicle. The Mark 14 was 20 feet 6 inches long. It weighed 3,209 pounds. Inside that hole were a propulsion system, a depth-keeping mechanism, a gyroscope for directional control, and a warhead containing 643 pounds of Torpex explosive, enough to split a destroyer in half if it detonated correctly. The depth-keeping mechanism was the first failure point. The Mark 14 ran on average 11 feet deeper than its set depth. This was a manufacturing tolerance problem in the depth mechanism's Borden tube, a curved pressure-sensing element that controlled the depth rudders. The tube had been calibrated using a test apparatus that did not accurately replicate actual water pressure at depth. The error had been present since 1938. It was not identified because live-fire depth tests were conducted in shallow water, where the disparity was smaller and within what testers considered acceptable variance. In Pacific combat, a torpedo set to run at 10 feet, targeting a destroyer with a draft of 12 feet, routinely passed beneath the keel entirely. The crew heard the torpedo run. They waited. Nothing happened. The second failure was the Mark VI magnetic influence exploder. The magnetic exploder was designed to detonate the weapon when it passed beneath the magnetic field of a steel hull, even without direct contact. In theory, this would trigger the explosion under the keel, where the hull was structurally weakest. In practice, the Pacific's equatorial magnetic field was different enough from the North Atlantic environment where the device had been calibrated that the exploder triggered erratically, sometimes early, sometimes not, occasionally on the approach of the torpedo's own wake. Commanders were authorized to disable the magnetic feature in June 1943. They were told the contact exploder, the backup, would function reliably. It did not. The contact exploder was the Mark VI's third and most serious failure. When a torpedo struck a hull at the ideal 90-degree angle, the impact was so abrupt, so mechanically violent, that the firing pin, which needed a fraction of a second to travel forward into the primer, was sheared off before it completed that travel. The pin was made of hardened steel. It bent anyway. Oblique hits, glancing impacts at 45 degrees or less, actually had a higher detonation rate. Because the impact was slower and less forceful, the pin had time to function correctly. The weapon worked better when it missed the target cleanly. Commander Daspit of the USS Tenosa understood this in July 1943. He had 15 torpedoes remaining after expending his first salvo on the Japanese whale factory ship Tonan Maru III, a 19,000-ton vessel sitting stationary in the water. He fired all 15 at point-blank range. Not one detonated. He brought the remaining dud back to Pearl Harbor in the torpedo tube, intact, for examination, something that had never been done before and required considerable nerve given that he was transporting a live warhead through a submarine's pressure hull. The Bureau of Ordnance examined it. The problem was identified within weeks. The fix, a redesigned, heavier firing pin assembly, was in production by September 1943. It had been in service since 1931. Subscribe if you want more of these. We're not done with this one yet. The depth problem had been raised formally in October 1941, 2 months before Pearl Harbor. Commander James Fife, then head of the submarine school at New London, submitted a report noting anomalous depth performance in Mark 14 exercises. The Bureau of Ordnance reviewed the report and concluded the discrepancies were within acceptable tolerance. The weapon was not recalled. No further testing was mandated. The report was filed. After Pearl Harbor, as American submarines began offensive patrols in the Pacific, the reports multiplied. December 1941, January 1942, February. Each patrol report from each submarine command documented the same pattern: torpedoes running deep, targets surviving hits, weapon performance inconsistent with specifications. The Bureau's position was consistent throughout. The weapons were performing correctly. The problem was crew technique. This was not a bureaucratic accident. It was a structural feature of how the Bureau of Ordnance related to the submarine force. Torpedoes were manufactured, tested, and certified by the Bureau. The Bureau had staked its institutional reputation on the Mark 14 and the Mark VI exploder. Admitting a systemic flaw meant admitting that every pre-war test had been inadequate. It meant admitting that the live fire testing budget, deliberately constrained to preserve expensive weapons, had been false economy of the most dangerous kind. It also meant admitting something harder, that the weapons designers had never fully tested it against the conditions in which it would actually be used. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding the submarine force in Australia, eventually conducted his own tests in June 1942. He fired Mark 14 torpedoes into a net suspended in the water and measured their actual running depth. The results confirmed what his commanders had been reporting for 6 months. The weapons ran an average of 11 feet deep. He sent the data to Washington. The Bureau disputed the methodology. Lockwood redesigned the test. He fired again. He sent those results. The Bureau acknowledged a depth discrepancy of approximately 3 feet, less than a third of the actual measurement, and issued a correction to depth settings. The actual figure, 11 feet, was not formally acknowledged. The depth fix went into effect in August 1942. The magnetic exploder was authorized for deactivation in June 1943. The contact exploder firing pin, the final fundamental failure, was not identified and corrected until September 1943, 22 months after Pearl Harbor. During those 22 months, American submarines conducted 350 war patrols. They fired thousands of torpedoes. How many ships survived because the weapons malfunctioned cannot be precisely calculated. What can be calculated is this: the submarine force accounted for less than 2% of U.S. Navy personnel and absorbed 22% of all U.S. Navy fatalities in the Pacific War. Submariners operated under depth-charge attacks without air cover in enemy waters with weapons that the men responsible for those weapons had certified as functional. The skippers who wrote the reports were not disbelieved because the evidence was weak. The evidence was thorough and consistent and came from experienced officers operating under combat conditions. They were disbelieved because the institution that made the weapon could not afford, professionally or politically, to agree with them. That is not a technical failure. The technical failures were fixable and were eventually fixed. What took 22 months to fix was the institutional decision to stop protecting the weapon and start listening to the men who used it. By the end of 1943, the Mark 14, with its corrected firing pin and depth mechanism, was finally performing as designed. The submarine force, freed from the weight of a broken weapon, became the most destructive anti-shipping force in naval history. By August 1945, American submarines had sunk 1,314 Japanese merchant vessels, 55% of all Japanese merchant tonnage lost in the war. They had sunk 201 Japanese warships. They had, effectively, strangled the Japanese industrial economy by severing its supply lines. They did most of it in the last 2 years of the war. What the first 2 years looked like is harder to calculate. The ships that escaped, the patrols that returned with nothing despite valid attacks, the commanders who were relieved of their vessels, more than a dozen in 1942 alone, for poor performance measured in sinkings, in a period when the weapons they were given could not reliably sink ships. Some were reinstated, some were not. The Mark 14 torpedo is not a story about a weapon. Weapons fail, engineering is hard, testing is expensive, and manufacturing tolerances accumulate in ways that paper specifications don't predict. That's true of every military system built in a hurry for a war that hadn't started yet. What this story is a story about what institutions do when the gap between their documented performance and reality becomes impossible to ignore. The Bureau of Ordnance had 2 choices from October 1941 onward: investigate aggressively or defend the record. It chose the record for 22 months. The men who paid for that choice were submerged in enemy water, firing torpedoes that bounced off hulls, listening to the sound of their own weapons failing, and writing reports that the Bureau filed. A small number of original Mark 14 torpedoes survive in naval museums, including the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. They are displayed as instruments of Allied victory, which they eventually were. If you want to know the engineering stories that official history doesn't volunteer, subscribe. There are more of them.